a sinner in the eyes of the church, a man who transformed his palatial estate into a private harem exclusively for men, where young men painted with rouge and powder paraded openly as an arrogant challenge to all of Europe, a husband of pathological cruelty who heartlessly entombed his devoted wife in a dungeon for 23 years simply for the crime of being a woman, all while his heart beat only for the effeminate dandies and rugged guards who surrounded him. Yet ironically, the man harboring these desires, despised by his entire age, was none other than Louis II de Bourbon, known to the world with reverence as the Grand Condé. He was the greatest god of war in French history, a figure whose mere presence on the battlefield was said to be worth an army of 10,000 men. How could one man be both the savior of the Sun King's throne and a slave to the most forbidden lusts of the 17th century? Behind the dazzling cloak of the legendary general lies the question: was this the tragedy of a man forced to wear a mask to survive, or the defiant pride of a man who dared to live out his different nature in an age of conformity? The story begins not on the battlefield, but in the oppressive splendor of the Hôtel de Condé in Paris in the year 1621. France was a kingdom in transition, slowly emerging from the bloody chaos of the wars of religion and moving toward the absolute order of the Sun King, though that golden noon was still decades away. Louis was born into the highest echelon of this society, designated from his first breath as a prince of the blood. This was not merely a title, it was a distinctive theological and political status. It meant that the blood of St. Louis flowed in his veins, placing him just steps away from the throne itself. In the hierarchy of the Ancien Regime, the princes of the blood occupied a space between man and God, immune to the ordinary laws that governed the lives of lesser subjects. This immunity would prove to be the defining feature of his life, a shield that allowed him to indulge his darkest impulses without fear of retribution. But privilege came with a terrifying price. The young Louis, then known by the title Duc d'Enghien, was not raised as a child, but as a dynastic asset, a weapon forged by his father to secure the dominance of their house. His father, Henri II de Bourbon, was a man of grotesque contradictions, a figure who looms over Louis's early life like a dark storm cloud. Henri was notoriously avaricious, a man who, despite being one of the richest princes in Europe, was known to haggle over the price of candles and count the logs used in the fireplaces of his vast estates. Yet, he was possessed by a singular, consuming ambition to prove that the Condé were superior to the ruling branch of the Bourbon. He viewed his son not as a human being with emotional needs, but as a vessel for this ambition. The education of the young Duc d'Enghien was therefore planned with a rigor that bordered on cruelty. While other noblemen of his rank were content with learning to ride, fence, and dance, Louis was sent to the Jesuit college at Bourges, a decision that shocked the court. It was unheard of for a prince of the blood to sit on hard benches alongside the sons of lawyers and merchants, but Henri insisted. He wanted a son who could outthink the king's ministers as well as outfight the king's enemies. At Bourges, the young duke displayed a brilliance that was both dazzling and unsettling. He devoured Latin, history, mathematics, and philosophy, displaying a memory that his tutors described as prodigious. He could recite entire passages of Tacitus and Livy, drawing lessons on strategy and statecraft that were far beyond his years. But this intellectual hothouse environment also nurtured a profound arrogance. Aware of his superiority in both birth and intellect, Louis developed a sharp, biting wit that he used to humiliate those he deemed inferior, a habit that would earn him lifelong enemies. It was also during these formative years that the first whispers of his peculiar nature began to circulate. The Jesuit environment, with its all-male intensity and emphasis on classical antiquity, was a world where intense male friendships were the norm. In the close confines of the college, Louis found himself drawn to the company of other young men in a way that transcended simple camaraderie. While the official records of his youth are carefully scrubbed of explicit detail, the later commentary of observers like Tallemant de Réau suggests that the Italian vice, the coded term for sodomy, was not unknown in the circles the young prince frequented. The classical heroes he studied, Alexander and Hephaestion, Achilles and Patroclus, provided a template for a type of male love that was heroic, intense, and exclusive, a model that Louis would seek to replicate for the rest of his life. However, the most intense relationship of his youth was not with a schoolmate, but with his own sister, Anne Geneviève de Bourbon, the future Duchesse de Longueville. She was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed of a romantic spirit that matched his own. The bond between brother and sister was so close, so exclusive, that it scandalized the court. They spoke a private language, shared inside jokes, and presented a united front of disdain against the rest of the world. In the fevered gossip mills of Paris, where calumny was a spectator sport, rumors of incest were inevitable. Whether these rumors had any basis in fact is lost to history, but the emotional reality was undeniable. For the young Louis, the only woman who ever truly mattered, the only female intellect he respected, was his sister. This intense fixation on his sister would have disastrous consequences for his ability to relate to other women, most notably the unfortunate girl chosen to be his wife. The marriage of the Duc d'Enghien was the first great tragedy of his life, a moment where the crushing weight of his father's ambition collided with his own pride. In 1640, France was effectively ruled by the Iron Cardinal, Richelieu. Henri II de Bourbon, always grasping for more power and favor, struck a devil's bargain. He agreed to marry his brilliant, royal-blooded son to Richelieu's niece, Claire Clémence de Maillé-Brézé. To the young Louis, this was an insult beyond measure. The Condé were descendants of kings. The Maillé-Brézé were merely minor nobility uplifted by the cardinal's nepotism. In the rigid hierarchy of the day, this was a mésalliance, a pollution of the royal blood. But worse than the social slight was the person of the bride herself. Claire Clémence was 13 years old, physically underdeveloped, painfully shy, and famously plain. She was a child who preferred playing with dolls to navigating the shark tank of the French court. When Louis first saw her, he was appalled. He, the dashing young prince who fancied himself a demigod, was to be shackled to this little wretch, as he cruelly dubbed her. He begged his father to call off the match. He raged, he wept, he threatened to join the church, but Henri was immovable. The fear of Richelieu was too great, and the dowry was too large. The wedding took place in February 1641, a grim affair where the groom could barely conceal his disgust. The wedding night was a notorious disaster. It was reported by the voyeuristic courtiers who tracked such things that the young duke, feverish with illness and resentment, performed his duty only under extreme duress. From that night on, he treated Claire Clémence not as a wife, but as a living symbol of his humiliation. He ignored her in public, mocked her appearance to his friends, and sought comfort in the arms of others. It was in the misery of this forced marriage that Louis's libertine reputation began to solidify. Desperate to escape the domestic suffocation of his home, he threw himself into the wildest excesses of Parisian society. He began to frequent the salons of the précieuses, but more importantly, he began to surround himself with a coterie of young officers who shared his disdain for convention. This was the embryonic stage of the petit maître. In this all-male world of drinking, gambling, and military planning, Louis found a freedom he could not find in the arms of a woman he despised. The psychological pattern was set. Women represented duty, entrapment, and social obligation. Men represented freedom, intellectual equality, and pleasure. The misogyny that later historians would attribute to him was not necessarily a hatred of women in the abstract, but a specific visceral reaction to the political trap of matrimony. But a prince of the blood could not spend his life merely dissipating in Paris. The destiny of the Condé was war. In 1643, as the health of King Louis XIII began to fail and the shadows of a regency loomed over France, the military situation on the borders was dire. The Spanish Empire, though past its zenith, was still the formidable giant of Europe. Its infantry, the tercios, had not suffered a decisive defeat in over 100 years. They were marching on France, threatening the northern frontier. In a gamble that terrified the seasoned ministers of the crown, the command of the army of Picardy was given to the 21-year-old Duc d'Enghien. It was a political appointment intended to secure the loyalty of the Condé family during the fragile transition of power. No one, not even his father, truly expected the boy to exercise real command. He was saddled with an older, cautious advisor, the Maréchal de l'Hôpital, whose job was to curb the young prince's enthusiasm and prevent him from doing anything rash. Louis arrived at the front in May 1643, a young man burning with a need to prove himself, to wash away the stain of his marriage and the suffocating control of his father in the blood of the enemy. The army he found was demoralized, unpaid, and frightened of the Spanish reputation. The older generals looked at this frail, hawk-nosed boy with his unkempt hair and his fiery eyes and saw only a pampered courtier playing at war. They did not see the mind that had absorbed the lessons of Caesar and Alexander. They did not see the desperate, almost suicidal bravery that lurked beneath his arrogant veneer. Louis ignored L'Hôpital's caution. He spent days in the saddle, scouting the terrain himself, talking to the common soldiers, eating their black bread, and sleeping on the ground. He was transforming before their eyes, shedding the skin of the courtier and revealing the predator underneath. The stage was set at Rocroi, a small fortified town in the Ardennes. The Spanish army, led by the seasoned Francisco de Melo, had laid siege to the town. They outnumbered the French and held the superior ground. By all the rules of conventional warfare, the French should have withdrawn or engaged in a limited skirmish. L'Hôpital urged caution, begging the Duke not to risk the king's army in a pitched battle. But Louis d'Enghien saw something else. He saw a gap in the Spanish deployment, a subtle weakness in the way their cavalry was positioned. He saw a chance not just to relieve the town, but to destroy the enemy army in its entirety. On the night before the battle, while his officers paced nervously and the older marshals wrote letters preparing for defeat, Louis famously slept so soundly that he had to be shaken awake at dawn. This preternatural calm, this icy detachment in the face of death, was the hallmark of his genius. He rose, donned a hat adorned with large white plumes to make himself a conspicuous target, and mounted his horse. He was about to ride into history, leaving behind the miserable husband and the dutiful son, and becoming the Grand Condé. As the sun rose over the misty fields, the era of Spanish dominance was about to face its reckoning. The dawn of May 19, 1643, broke with a silence that belied the slaughter to come. On one side stood the Spanish army, a terrifying machine of war that had dominated Europe for a century. At its heart were the tercios, massive, impenetrable squares of pikemen and musketeers. These men were veterans, hardened by decades of combat in the Low Countries, disciplined to a point where they were considered less like soldiers and more like a force of nature. They were commanded by Francisco de Mello, who waited with the patience of a man who believes victory is inevitable. On the other side was the French army, a ragged mix of mercenaries and conscripts, led by a boy of 21 who had never commanded a battle in his life. The older French marshals were trembling. They knew that if this battle was lost, the road to Paris would be open. The kingdom of France, with its dying king in the capital, would be at the mercy of Spain. But Louis Duc d'Enghien did not tremble. He had spent the night not in prayer, but in deep, untroubled sleep. When he awoke, he dressed with a deliberate theatricality. He refused the heavy helmet that would have obscured his face. Instead, he wore a felt hat adorned with enormous white plumes. He wanted his men to see him. He wanted the enemy to see him. He wanted to be the focal point of the carnage. At 3 a.m., contrary to all established military doctrine, which dictated waiting for full daylight, he ordered the advance. The battle that followed was not merely a clash of arms. It was the birth of a legend. The French right wing, led personally by Enghien, smashed into the Spanish cavalry. It was here that the young duke's genius revealed itself. A lesser commander would have chased the fleeing Spanish horsemen off the field, seeking easy glory. Louis did the opposite. He halted his frenzied cavalry, turned them 90 degrees, and swept behind the enemy lines. It was a maneuver of breathtaking risk and precision. He slammed into the exposed rear of the Spanish infantry, the tercios themselves. The scene was apocalyptic. The Spanish squares, those floating fortresses of pikes, were suddenly attacked from all sides. The French infantry pressed from the front, while Enghien's cavalry hammered them from the back. Yet the Spanish did not break. They stood their ground with a grim heroism that earned the admiration of the French. The old Count of Fuentes, the commander of the Spanish infantry, was so crippled by gout that he could not stand. He sat in a sedan chair in the middle of the square, shouting orders until he was cut down. The pivotal moment came when Enghien, his white plumes stained with smoke and blood, rode forward to accept a surrender. A misunderstanding, or perhaps a final act of Spanish defiance, caused the enemy musketeers to open fire. Enraged by what he saw as treachery, Enghien unleashed his men. The slaughter that followed was total. By noon, the invincible Spanish army was no more. 7,000 lay dead, nearly as many were captured. The young duke, exhausted and exhilarated, knelt on the battlefield to offer a prayer of thanks, surrounded by the wreckage of the Spanish Empire. The news of Rocroi hit Paris like a thunderbolt. The king, Louis XIII, had died just days before the victory was confirmed, leaving the throne to his 4-year-old son, Louis XIV. The timing was providential. The monarchy was at its weakest moment, a child king and a foreign regent, Anne of Austria. The victory at Rocroi saved the regime. It provided the instant legitimacy the new government desperately needed. And the architect of this salvation was Louis de Bourbon. When he returned to Paris, the Duc d'Enghien was no longer just a prince of the blood. He was a demigod. The streets were lined with cheering crowds. Poets wrote odes comparing him to Mars, to Hercules, to Alexander. At court, women swooned and men bowed lower than they ever had before. But amidst this adulation, a dangerous transformation was taking place in Louis's psyche. The arrogance that had been nurtured by his father and the Jesuits now hardened into a terrifying hubris. He began to believe his own myth. He had saved France, therefore, France owed him everything. It was in this post-Rocroi period that his disdain for social norms became aggressive. He appeared at court not in the silks and velvets expected of a prince, but often in disheveled military dress, his hair wild, his boots muddy. It was a calculated affectation, the look of the soldier prince who was too busy saving the nation to care about fashion. But beneath this rough exterior, his private life was becoming increasingly libertine. The band of brothers he had led at Rocroi became the nucleus of his social world. These men, young officers, who had ridden with him through the fire, were the only people he respected. They shared a bond of blood and adrenaline that no woman, certainly not his pitiful wife Claire Clemence, could understand. The years following Rocroi, from 1643 to 1648, were a blur of military triumphs. He won at Freiburg, he won at Nördlingen, he won at Lens. Each victory was bloodier and more costly than the last, earning him a reputation for being careless with the lives of his men, but the results were undeniable. He was the sword of the regency. However, the hand wielding that sword was not the king, but the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, and her prime minister, Cardinal Mazarin. The relationship between the Grand Condé, he inherited the title upon his father's death in 1646, and Cardinal Mazarin is one of the great psychological duels of the century. Mazarin was everything Condé was not: subtle, patient, Italian, and manipulative. Condé despised him. To the prince, Mazarin was a low-born bureaucrat, a foreigner stealing the wealth of France. Condé felt that he, as the premier prince of the blood and the greatest general of the age, should be the true power behind the throne. He began to treat Mazarin with open contempt, mocking his accent, tugging at his beard in jest, and demanding exorbitant positions and money for his friends. It was here that the petit maître fully emerged as a political and social force. This clique surrounding Condé began to terrorize the good manners of the court. They were a bizarre mix of hyper-masculine aggression and effeminate affectation. They would spend their days hunting and fencing, and their nights in heavy makeup screaming with laughter at the pious interrupting mass and engaging in orgies that were whispered about with horror by the devout party. They were punk before the concept existed, aristocratic hooligans who knew they were untouchable because their leader was the Grand Condé. The sexual dynamic of this group was complex. While the church railed against sodomy, Condé's circle flaunted a bisexual ambiguity that was fashionable among the libertine elite. But for Condé, it seemed to be more than fashion. His emotional detachment from women was growing more pronounced. He barely visited his wife. When she fell ill, he expressed more concern for his horses. His letters from this period, particularly to his friends, like the Marquis de la Musée, reveal a man who found emotional resonance only in the company of other men. This was not the soft, romanticized homosexuality of later centuries. This was a hard military camaraderie that bled into the erotic. It was the love of the trench and the camp brought into the gilded salons of Paris. By 1648, the tension between Condé's ambition and the crown's authority reached a breaking point. France was bankrupt from the long wars. The Parlement of Paris, a judicial body, began to rebel against the taxes imposed by Mazarin. This was the beginning of the civil wars, known as the Frond. Initially, the Queen Regent turned to her hero. She begged Condé to save the monarchy once again, this time from its own people. Condé agreed, but with a sneer. He blockaded Paris in 1649, starving the city into submission. He viewed the parliamentary rebels as rabble, unworthy of his attention. He crushed the first Frond with the same efficiency he had crushed the Spanish, but his victory was the seed of his undoing. Having saved the queen twice, once from Spain and once from the Parlement, he now felt he owned the crown. His behavior in 1649 became intolerable. He demanded that the queen grant him territories that would effectively make him a state within a state. He publicly humiliated Mazarin, threatening to throw the cardinal into the Seine. He was out of control. The hero had become the monster. The queen, Anne of Austria, was a woman of immense pride. She had loved Condé as a savior, but she would not tolerate him as a master. She and Mazarin came to a secret, terrifying conclusion. The Grand Condé, the greatest asset of France, had to be neutralized. The trap was sprung in January 1650. It was a masterpiece of deception. Condé, his brother Conti, and his brother-in-law Longueville were summoned to the Palais Royal under the guise of a council meeting. Condé arrived arrogant and unsuspecting, believing he was there to dictate terms. Instead, he was met by the captain of the guards, a man named Guiteau. When Guiteau politely asked for his sword, Condé laughed, thinking it was a joke. When he realized it was not, the shock was total. The god of war was arrested like a common criminal. He was whisked away in a carriage with shuttered windows to the fortress of Vincennes. The imprisonment of the princes of the blood sent a shockwave through Europe. It was a gamble of epic proportions by Mazarin. If Condé's army rebelled, the monarchy would fall. But inside the stone walls of Vincennes, a strange transformation occurred. Stripped of his armies, his flatterers, and his power, Louis de Bourbon was forced to confront himself. The Iron Prince broke down. He wept. He fell into deep depressions, and then he began to garden. He grew carnations. It was a surreal image, the destroyer of armies tending to delicate flowers in a prison courtyard. It was also during this imprisonment that the evidence of his specific desires became most tangible. Denied the frenetic activity of war and the court, his need for male intimacy poured out onto paper. He wrote letters to his friends on the outside, letters that were intercepted by Mazarin's spies. These were not political manifestos, they were cries of loneliness. One intercepted note, the infamous Petit Billet, was addressed to a young male favorite. The language was tender, desperate, and unmistakably romantic. It was the smoking gun that his enemies would whisper about for years. Meanwhile, on the outside, the one person he had consistently abused was fighting for him. Claire Clémence, the little wretch, escaped house arrest in a disguise. She rallied the nobility of the South. She raised an army. She, who had been mocked for playing with dolls, was now riding at the head of troops, holding her son in her arms, demanding the release of her husband. It was a display of loyalty that shamed the Grand Condé, though it would not change his heart. The imprisonment lasted 13 months. When he was finally released in 1651, as part of a political deal, he was a changed man. The loyalty to the crown was gone, replaced by a cold, hard hatred for Mazarin and the queen. He returned to Paris not as a savior, but as an avenger. The first Frond had been a dispute over taxes. The second Frond, the Frond of the princes, would be a personal war. Condé was now willing to burn France to the ground to satisfy his vengeance. He entered into secret negotiations with Spain, the very enemy he had destroyed at Rocroi. The hero of France was about to become its greatest traitor. Following his release in February 1651, amidst bonfires of celebration, Louis de Bourbon emerged not as a chastened subject, but as a man possessed by a cold, crystallized fury. The imprisonment had stripped away the last vestiges of his loyalty to the concept of the French state. He now viewed the crown, embodied by the Queen Regent Anne of Austria and her Italian minister Mazarin, as a personal enemy that had humiliated him. In his mind, the state was no longer a sacred entity to be defended. It was a prize to be seized. He returned to the capital with the swagger of a conqueror, his carriage surrounded by thousands of cheering Parisians who, in their fickle nature, had forgotten that just 2 years prior he had been the one starving them into submission. Now he was their champion against the hated cardinal. The tragedy of the Fronde lies in the duel between two men who were arguably the greatest captains of their age, Condé and Turenne. They were cousins, they were friends, and they were equals in military genius. But in this chaotic period, their paths diverged with a symmetry that feels scripted by a tragedian. While Condé, the prince of the blood, chose the path of rebellion and ego, Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, Vicomte de Turenne, a Protestant and a foreigner by birth, chose the path of loyalty. Turenne saw that the state must survive the men who run it. Condé saw the state as an extension of his own glory. When Turenne sided with the young king Louis XIV and the Queen Mother, the stage was set for a fratricidal conflict that would tear the heart out of France. By the summer of 1651, negotiations had failed. Condé, feeling his life was in danger from Mazarin's assassins, a paranoia that was not entirely unfounded, fled Paris for his stronghold in the south, Bordeaux. There, he did the unthinkable. He signed a formal treaty with Philip IV of Spain. He promised to hand over French ports and fortresses to the enemy in exchange for Spanish gold and troops. It was high treason, stark and undeniable. The hero of Rocroi, the man who had broken the Spanish Empire, was now its paid mercenary. He justified this to himself with the feudal logic of his ancestors. His duty was to his house and his honor, not to a king who had disrespected him. The war that followed was ugly, confusing, and devastating for the peasantry, but it culminated in one of the most dramatic days in the history of Paris, the Battle of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine on July 2nd, 1652. Condé had marched his rebel army to the very gates of Paris, hoping the city would open its doors to him. But the Parisians, weary of war and fearful of the royal army pursuing him, kept the gates barred. Condé was trapped against the city walls, with Turenne's royal army hammering him from the rear. The battle was a chaotic, bloody swirl of dust and heat. Condé fought with the energy of a demon. He was everywhere at once. Observers described him as terrifying to behold. His clothes were shredded, his face was masked in a thick layer of dust, sweat, and blood, and his sword was bent from the force of his blows. He led charge after charge against Turenne's superior numbers, trying to buy time. At one point he was cornered in a narrow street, fighting hand-to-hand like a common trooper. It was the apotheosis of his warrior persona, stripped of all princely finery, reduced to pure violence. He would have died there, crushed against the gate of Saint-Antoine, had it not been for the intervention of another extraordinary figure, his cousin, Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, known as La Grande Mademoiselle. She was the wealthiest heiress in Europe, a woman of immense spirit, who had long harbored a crush on Condé, despite his indifference to her. Seeing her hero about to be slaughtered, she took command of the Bastille. She ordered the cannon of the fortress, the king's own cannon, to be turned against the king's army. She fired on Turenne, shocking the royalist forces into a halt. Then she ordered the gates of Paris to be opened. Condé rode into the city saved from annihilation. But the scene of his entry was not triumphant. It was horrific. He was weeping not from relief but from rage and exhaustion. When La Grande Mademoiselle greeted him, expecting gratitude, she found a man on the verge of a breakdown. He was covered in gore, shaking and screaming about the friends he had lost in the battle. Specifically, He mourned the Duke of Nemours, his brother-in-law, and one of the petits maîtres who had been wounded. Condé's grief was visceral and focused entirely on his male companions. He collapsed onto a bed in the Hôtel de Ville, fully clothed and filthy, and slept the sleep of the dead while Paris burned around him. The salvation was temporary. The mood in Paris turned dark. The populace, initially supportive of the princes, grew tired of the anarchy. On July 4th, 1652, a massacre occurred at the Hôtel de Ville. A mob, likely incited by Condé's agents to intimidate the city council, went out of control. They set fire to the building and slaughtered the magistrates inside. Condé, who was supposed to be the protector of the people, did nothing to stop it. He watched the smoke rise with an indifference that chilled his allies. This was the turning point. Paris rejected him. The bourgeoisie rejected him. The church rejected him. He realized that he could not win the crown, nor could he defeat Turenne decisively. In October 1652, beaten and isolated, Louis de Bourbon made the final crossing. He left France. He rode north, crossing the border into the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. He was no longer a French rebel. He was now a Spanish general. The King of Spain, delighted to have his greatest enemy now leading his armies, appointed him generalissimo of the Spanish forces. The years of exile, 1653 to 1659, are often glossed over in standard biographies, yet they are crucial for understanding the open secret of his private life. Condé established a court in exile at Brussels, a surreal mirror image of the French court. Here, stripped of the constraints of French opinion and away from the prying eyes of the Paris clergy, his lifestyle became even more brazen. The Spanish court was rigid, somber, and obsessed with etiquette. They were horrified by Condé. He was informal, loud, and mocked their religious processions. But they needed him. In Brussels, Condé gathered the remnants of his petits maîtres who had followed him into exile. The atmosphere at the Palais d'Orange, his residence, was one of frenzied dissipation. It was a fraternity house for exiled aristocrats. They drank, they gambled, and they engaged in relationships that the Spanish referred to with hushed revulsion. It is here that the figure of the young page Gourville becomes central. Jean Hérault, known as Gourville, was a man of low birth but high intelligence who became Condé's indispensable fixer. He managed the prince's finances, his correspondence, and his private life. Gourville's memoirs are a masterpiece of discretion, yet reading between the lines, the intimacy is palpable. He describes nights spent in the prince's chamber, long conversations that lasted until dawn, and a trust that went far beyond master and servant. Condé, who treated dukes with contempt, treated Gourville with a tenderness he showed to no one else. But what of Claire Clémence? The little wretch had followed him into exile. She had saved his life during the Frond, raising armies and holding Bordeaux for him while he was in prison. She had proven herself to be a heroine of the Bourbon line. One might expect that this shared adversity would have softened his heart. It did the opposite. Condé could not forgive her for witnessing his humiliation. He could not forgive her for being the person who saved him. It wounded his vanity that he, the god of war, owed his life to a woman he considered physically repulsive. In Brussels, he treated her with icy cruelty. He set her up in a separate, modest household while he lived in splendor. He allowed his mistresses, for he still kept women for appearance's sake, like the captivating Madame de Châtillon, to mock her openly. Madame de Châtillon, a manipulative beauty who played both sides of the war, held sway over Condé for a time, but even she knew that her power was limited. She famously remarked that to truly control the prince, one had to be a man. The military campaigns during his Spanish exile were a frustrating grinding down of his reputation. He was fighting Turenne again, but this time Turenne had the resources of France, while Condé was hamstrung by the sluggish Spanish bureaucracy. He won battles. He relieved the siege of Valenciennes in a brilliant maneuver that stunned Europe, but he could not win the war. The Battle of the Dunes in 1658 was the death knell of his hopes. Facing an Anglo-French coalition, Cromwell's redcoats fighting alongside Turenne's troops, Condé saw his Spanish allies crumbling. He fought with his usual suicidal bravery, but he was defeated. He reportedly told a British officer, "You do not know the Spanish I do, and I tell you we are lost." The defeat at the Dunes forced Spain to the negotiating table. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 ended the war, but the biggest sticking point in the treaty was the fate of the Grand Condé. Louis XIV and Mazarin wanted to destroy him. Spain, bound by honor, insisted that their generalissimo be restored to all his titles and lands. It was a diplomatic standoff. In the end, Mazarin, ever the pragmatist, yielded. He knew that a Condé inside the tent pissing out was better than a Condé outside pissing in. So, in January 1660, the prodigal son returned. The meeting between Louis XIV and the Grand Condé at Aix-en-Provence is one of the most heavily analyzed moments of the century. Condé, now nearly 40, prematurely aged by war and dissipation, threw himself at the feet of the 21-year-old king. Louis XIV, who would later become the personification of absolute monarchy, looked down at the man who had tried to steal his crown. The tension was suffocating. Then the king spoke. He did not embrace his cousin. He simply said, "Cousin, you have grown old." It was a subtle, devastating put-down. It signaled that the era of the warrior prince was over. The era of the Sun King had begun. Condé was restored to his estates, his governorship of Burgundy, and his rank. But he was stripped of real power. He was not invited to the king's secret council. He was a gilded ornament, a relic of a bygone age. He retreated to his estate at Chantilly, and it is here, in the twilight of his political ambition, that the most fascinating and disturbing chapter of his private life begins. Chantilly became his personal kingdom, a place where he could rule as an absolute monarch over a court of artists, intellectuals, and, most importantly, beautiful young men. The school of Chantilly, as it came to be known, was a cultural phenomenon. Condé denied the battlefield, poured his energy into gardening and patronage. He hired Le Notre to design the gardens, Vatel to run the kitchens, and Molière to write the plays. But the inner circle remained the petit maître. The composition of the group changed as the older members died or married, but the archetype remained the same: young, handsome, witty, and morally flexible. It was during this period that the whispers turned into a roar. The king's brother, Philippe d'Orléans, known as Monsieur, was also openly homosexual, but Philippe was effeminate, wearing dresses and jewelry. Condé's homosexuality, or Italian taste, was different. It was the sexuality of the barracks. It was aggressive, predatory, and deeply misogynistic. He did not want to be a woman. He wanted to conquer men. The tragic figure of Claire Clémence was now completely marginalized. At Chantilly, she wandered the gardens like a ghost. Condé rarely spoke to her. The psychological abuse escalated. He began to paranoidly accuse her of infidelity, a classic projection. He was convinced she was sleeping with her servants. This paranoia would eventually culminate in the scandal of the footman in 1671, an event so bizarre and cruel that it shocked even the cynical court of Versailles. But before we reach that nadir, we must examine the intellectual mask Condé wore. He became a patron of the libertines of the mind, freethinkers like Saint-Evremont and Pierre Bayle, who questioned religious dogma. Condé's atheism was the twin of his sodomy. In the 17th century, to deny God and to commit sodomy were seen as two sides of the same coin, a rejection of the natural order. Bishop Bossuet, the great eagle of the church, spent years trying to convert Condé, engaging him in long theological debates at Chantilly. Condé enjoyed the intellectual sparring, but he remained a skeptic. He famously remarked during a religious procession that he could not believe in a God who would allow himself to be eaten in a wafer. This intellectual arrogance shielded him. He was too smart for the priests and too powerful for the police. But the 1660s were not just about gardening and debating. The king needed his sword one last time. In 1668, Louis XIV launched the War of Devolution. He needed a general to conquer the Franche-Comté. He turned to the old lion. Condé, desperate to prove he was still the hero of Rocroi, accepted the command. He conquered the province in 14 days. It was a flash of the old brilliance. But the campaign also highlighted his physical decline. He was suffering from terrible gout, a hereditary Bourbon curse. He could no longer mount a horse without assistance. He was a cripple leading an army, carried in a litter, yet his mind was as sharp as ever. The return to favor brought him back to Versailles, the new center of the universe. Here, the aging Condé cut a strange figure. He was terrified of the king. The man who had charged the Spanish guns trembled before the cold stare of Louis XIV. He became a sycophant, desperate to please the monarch he had once fought. He even tried to curry favor by offering his son Henri Jules to the king's service. Henri Jules, the Duc d'Enghien, he took his father's old title, is a critical part of this story. If Louis was peculiar, Henri Jules was clinically insane. He inherited his father's sadism, but none of his genius. He was known to beat his servants, shoot at passers-by for sport, and, in a grotesque mimicry of his father, pursue men with a violence that lacked any of Condé's charm. Condé's relationship with his son was fraught. He loved him, but he also despised him for his mediocrity. Yet, he protected him. The House of Condé had to survive. As the 1670s approached, the shadows at Chantilly grew longer. The festive atmosphere of the early years gave way to something darker. The petit maîtres were aging, the jokes were getting stale, and the tension between Condé and his wife was reaching a breaking point. The stage was set for the final act of domestic tragedy, where the hero would commit a crime not against the state, but against the woman who had loved him most. The year 1671 began with a scandal that would forever stain the private reputation of the Grand Condé, a domestic tragedy so murky and cruel that it shocked even the cynical courtiers of Versailles. For 30 years, Claire Clémence had been the silent victim of her husband's contempt. She had been mocked, ignored, and financially marginalized, yet she had remained the dutiful princess of the blood. But as Condé aged, his resentment toward the woman who had been forced upon him by Richelieu curdled into active hatred. He wanted her gone. He wanted the freedom to live his life at Chantilly without the constant, reproachful presence of the wife he had never loved. Fate, or perhaps a darker machination, provided him with the opportunity in the form of a lowly footman named Duval. On a cold January day at the Condé residence, a violent altercation broke out in the princess's apartments. Screams were heard. When the servants rushed in, they found Claire Clémence bleeding profusely from a stab wound to the chest. Standing over her was Duval the footman. The official story, quickly disseminated by Condé's agents, was that the princess had been caught in an illicit affair with the servant, and, in a lover's quarrel, he had stabbed her. A different, more plausible version whispered among the servants suggested that Duval had been arguing with another servant, and the princess, in a characteristic act of naive bravery, had stepped between them to stop the fight and was accidentally struck. Regardless of the truth, Condé seized upon the incident with the ruthless opportunism of a general spotting a gap in the enemy line. He did not rush to his wife's bedside to comfort her. Instead, he went straight to the king. He painted a picture of a deranged, unfaithful wife who had dishonored the House of Bourbon by sleeping with a lackey. It was a monstrous lie. Claire Clémence was known for her piety and her timid nature, but Condé was a prince of the blood, and his word was law in his own house. He demanded a lettre de cachet, a royal order that would allow him to imprison her without trial. Louis XIV, perhaps weary of the Condé family drama, or perhaps simply abiding by the patriarchal code that gave a husband absolute dominion over his wife, granted the request. The fate of Claire Clémence is one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the history of the French nobility. She recovered from her physical wound, only to receive a wound to the soul that would never heal. She was stripped of her title, her jewelry, and her children. She was bundled into a carriage and driven to the remote, gloomy fortress of Châteauroux in the Berry region. There, she was locked away, effectively buried alive. Condé gave strict orders. She was to see no one, receive no letters, and never leave the castle grounds. For the next 23 years, until her death in 1694, the woman who had once raised an army to save her husband from prison stared at the same gray stone walls, slowly descending into madness. Condé never visited her. He never spoke her name again. To him, she was dead. The problem had been solved. With his domestic life brutally sanitized, Condé turned his eyes back to the only thing that gave him purpose: war. In 1672, Louis XIV launched the Dutch War, a massive conflict aimed at crushing the Dutch Republic. The king, now in his 30s and eager for military glory, wanted the best generals in Europe at his side. He called upon the two old lions, Turenne and Condé. The Grand Condé, who rode out to war in 1672, was a shadow of the youth who had triumphed at Rocroi. He was 51 years old, a relic in an era where most men died by 40. His body was racked with gout, the painful arthritis that plagued the Bourbon line. His hands were often so swollen he could not hold a sword, his feet so tender he could not wear boots. He had to be lifted onto his horse by squires. But the mind, the predator's instinct, was untouched by age. When the trumpets sounded, the years seemed to fall away. The campaign began with the famous crossing of the Rhine in June 1672. It was meant to be a glorious propaganda moment for the king, a triumphant passage into enemy territory. But for Condé, it nearly ended in disaster. As the French cavalry splashed across the river, a Dutch officer fired a pistol at point-blank range. The bullet shattered Condé's wrist. The pain was excruciating. The prince, who had survived the slaughter of Lens and the dusty melee of Saint-Antoine, was taken out of action by a single shot in a skirmish. He was furious. He had to be carried back to camp, cursing the Dutch, the war, and his own frailty. He spent months recovering, nursing his shattered arm and his wounded pride while Turenne won the glory. But the war dragged on. The Dutch, led by the young William of Orange, a man who would become Condé's new nemesis, opened the dikes, flooding their own country to stop the French advance. The war turned into a stalemate of sieges and mud. It was exactly the kind of war Condé hated. He was a man of movement, of the lightning strike, not the slow strangulation of trench warfare. In 1674, he got his chance for one last great battle. The scene was Senef in modern-day Belgium. The Prince of Orange was maneuvering a massive coalition army to invade France. Condé, commanding the French army in Flanders, saw an opportunity to catch them on the march. What followed was the Battle of Senef, one of the bloodiest days of the 17th century. It began as a tactical masterpiece. Condé caught the Dutch rearguard by surprise and crushed it. A prudent general would have stopped there, claimed victory, and gone home. But Condé was not prudent. He was possessed. The battle frenzy that had defined his youth took hold of the crippled old man. He ordered his troops to pursue the main Dutch army into a heavily fortified position involving orchards, hedges, and a church. It was suicide. The French infantry was mowed down in waves for 17 hours under a burning August sun, and then by the light of the moon, the slaughter continued. Condé had 3 horses killed under him. At one point, unable to walk, he led a charge sword in hand, limping forward, screaming at his men to advance. It was madness. It was magnificent. It was horrifying. By the time the fighting died down, 27,000 men lay dead or wounded on the field. The carnage was so great that even the victors were sickened. When a junior officer tried to point out the staggering French casualties to him, Condé replied with a chilling callousness that has echoed through history, "One night in Paris will replace them all." Senef was a tactical draw, but a strategic victory, as it stopped the invasion. However, the cost was terrifying. When Condé returned to Versailles, the king received him at the top of the grand staircase, a rare honor. Condé, struggling to climb the steps on his gout-ridden legs, apologized for making the king wait. Louis XIV, in a moment of genuine grace, replied, "Cousin, when one carries such a load of laurels, one cannot walk fast." It was the zenith of his rehabilitation. The rebel of the Frond was forgiven, the hero of Senef was celebrated, but the final blow to his military career came not from an enemy, but from the loss of a friend. In July 1675, the great Turenne was killed by a cannonball at the Battle of Salzbach. The news devastated France. Turenne was the shield of the kingdom. With the German army threatening to cross into Alsace, the king turned to Condé one last time. "Go," the king said. "Only you can fill the void Turenne has left." Condé traveled to Alsace, but he was a broken man. The death of Turenne seemed to drain the last of his martial spirit. He outmaneuvered the German army, forcing them to retreat back across the Rhine without fighting a major battle. It was a campaign of pure skill, a bloodless victory that showed he had finally learned the lesson of restraint. But when he returned to court in late 1675, he knew it was over. He could no longer ride. He could no longer command. He formally asked the king for permission to retire. The final decade of his life, 1676 to 1686, was spent almost entirely at Chantilly. This was the Indian summer of the Grand Condé. The warrior laid down his sword and picked up the spade in the book. Chantilly became the intellectual capital of France, rivaling even Versailles. While the king's court became increasingly stiff, pious, and bored under the influence of Madame de Maintenon, Chantilly remained a bastion of free thought, wit, and pleasure. Condé surrounded himself with the finest minds of the age. Racine, Boileau, Molière, and La Fontaine were regular guests. They found in the prince a patron who was not just a source of money, but a genuine intellectual peer. He loved to debate philosophy, history, and theology. He pushed them to be bolder, sharper. He protected them from the censors. The man who had burned villages now nurtured poetry. But the petit maîtres were still there, though they, too, were aging. The wild orgies of the 1650s had softened into elegant dinners and refined debauchery. The Italian taste remained the open secret of the household. Condé's preference for male company never wavered. He continued to employ handsome young pages and equerries, showering them with gifts and favors. The courtiers whispered that the prince's apartments at Chantilly were a seraglio of men, but no one dared say it to his face. The aura of the great captain was too strong. However, the shadow of his son, Henri Jules, grew darker. As Condé's health failed, Henri Jules took over the management of the estate. The son's insanity became more pronounced. His behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He was terrified of drafts, convinced they would kill him. He was cruel to his own wife and children. Condé watched this with a heavy heart. He knew that the greatness of his line would die with him. He saw in Henri Jules a caricature of his own worst traits, the cruelty, the arrogance, without the redeeming genius. In the gardens of Chantilly, which he had spent millions to perfect, the old prince would have himself carried in a sedan chair. He would watch the fountains play, fountains that were a marvel of hydraulic engineering, defying gravity just as he had defied the king. He would sit for hours, staring at the water, perhaps thinking of the blood at Rocroi, the dust of the Frond, or the silence of the woman locked away in Châteauroux. He was a man trying to curate his own legacy. He commissioned artists to paint his battles, but he strictly controlled the narrative. He wanted to be remembered as the Mars of France, the loyal cousin, the hero. He worked hard to erase the traitor of the 1650s. But the past has a way of haunting the present. In 1680, the affair of the poisons broke out, a scandal involving witchcraft and poison that implicated the highest levels of the aristocracy. Whispers reached the king that the Condés might be involved, that they had sought to poison the royal family years ago. Nothing was proven, but the fear lingered. Condé knew that his immunity hung by a thread. As 1685 approached, the year of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the religious atmosphere in France tightened. The king became obsessed with saving his soul and the souls of his subjects. He cracked down on Protestants and libertines. Condé, the famous freethinker, felt the pressure. The Jesuits who had educated him circled closer, urging him to repent, to confess, to renounce his philosophical errors and his unnatural loves. The old wolf was cornered. He began to attend Mass more frequently, though whether out of genuine conversion or political necessity, no one could say. The tension between his true nature and the demands of the afterlife was building. The final battle would not be against the Spanish or the Dutch, but against death itself. The year 1685 was a watershed moment in the history of France. It was the year Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, effectively outlawing Protestantism and declaring that there was only one king, one law, one faith. The atmosphere at Versailles transformed from a playground of libertine excess into a suffocating cathedral of piety. The king, under the influence of his secret wife Madame de Maintenon, was determined to purify his realm before he faced his own judgment. For the Grand Condé, this shift was terrifying. He was the last survivor of a bygone era, an era of rebellion, of intellectual skepticism, and of Italian morals. He was a living anachronism, a dinosaur grazing in the perfectly manicured gardens of the new regime. To survive, the old wolf had to perform one final humiliating trick. He had to submit completely. The ultimate act of submission came in the form of a marriage. Louis XIV proposed a union that would once have been unthinkable to the proud House of Condé. He suggested that Condé's grandson, the young Louis de Bourbon, marry Mademoiselle de Nantes, the king's illegitimate daughter, with his mistress, Madame de Montespan. For a prince of the blood, whose veins held the sacred lineage of St. Louis, to mix his blood with a bastard, even a royal one, was a profound degradation. It was a stain on the dynastic purity that Condé had spent his life defending. But Condé, the pragmatist who had once sold himself to Spain, now sold his pride to the king. He accepted the match with a grotesque enthusiasm, bowing and scraping, organizing lavish fetes at Chantilly to celebrate the betrothal. It was a pathetic spectacle, the greatest general of the century reducing himself to a courtier, desperate to prove his loyalty so that his family would be safe after he was gone. Yet, even as he played the role of the doting grandfather and loyal subject, the old fires of his nature flared up one last time. In 1685, the same year as this dynastic submission, the Maneville scandal erupted. The Marquis de Maneville was one of the last of Condé's young favorites. When Maneville announced his intention to marry, the 64-year-old Condé fell into a jealous rage that rivaled the tantrums of his youth. He tried to block the marriage, using his influence to threaten the prospective bride's family. The court watched in stunned silence. It was a flash of the old Condé, possessive, tyrannical, and openly driven by same-sex desire. It proved that the conversion to piety was merely a mask. Underneath the velvet coat of the courtier beat the heart of the unrepentant libertine. But personal scandal soon gave way to a darker reality as the specter of death approached the court. In late 1685, a smallpox epidemic broke out. The dread disease, which respected neither rank nor title, struck the Duchess de Bourbon, the very granddaughter-in-law Condé had just welcomed into the family, the king's daughter. The court fled Fontainebleau in panic, scattering to avoid the contagion. But Condé did something extraordinary. He, whose health was already shattered, who could barely walk, chose to stay. He insisted on nursing the young woman himself. Why? Was it a genuine act of affection for the girl? Was it a final attempt to curry favor with the king by saving his daughter? Or was it perhaps a subconscious desire for an exit, a soldier's wish to die in the line of duty rather than in a bed? He sat by her bedside day and night, ignoring the warnings of his doctors. The Duchess recovered. Condé did not. On December 11, 1686, the prince collapsed. The fever took him quickly. The news raced to Versailles. The hero is dying. The king, in a rare display of emotion, sent messengers every hour. But at Fontainebleau, the scene was one of grim determination. The Jesuits, who had hovered around Condé for years like vultures waiting for a carcass, now moved in for the kill. They needed a confession. They needed the famous atheist, the famous sodomite, to bow before the cross. It would be the ultimate victory for the church, to claim the soul of the Grand Condé. Father Bergier, a Jesuit of iron will, sat by the bed. We have accounts of these final hours, and they are fraught with ambiguity. Condé was lucid. He spoke of his sins, but which sins? Did he confess the treason of the Frond? Did he confess the cruelty to his wife, still locked away in Châteauroux? Did he confess the petit maître? The official account claims he made a beautiful and edifying end, renouncing his errors and receiving the sacraments with tears in his eyes. But there is a counter-narrative whispered by the skeptics in the room. They noted that even as he prayed, he seemed detached, performing the rituals of death with the same cold precision he had used to maneuver battalions. He was doing what was expected. He was ensuring his family would not be persecuted for his heresy. It was his final campaign, the siege of heaven. On the morning of December 11th, Louis II de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, whispered his final words. They were not about God or the king or his wife. He reportedly asked for his son Henri Jules and gave him a piece of advice that summarized his own tortured existence. Preserve your rank. It is the only thing that matters. Then The light faded from the eyes that had seen the slaughter of Rocroi, the dungeons of Vincennes, and the gardens of Chantilly. The great Condé was dead. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in political theater. Louis XIV, upon hearing the news, pronounced a famous epitaph, "I have lost the greatest man in my kingdom." But the king's relief was palpable. The last rival, the last symbol of feudal independence, was gone. The monarchy was now truly absolute. The funeral held at Notre Dame in Paris was the event of the decade. The cathedral was draped in black velvet and silver. Thousands of candles flickered, illuminating the banners captured from the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Germans. And in the pulpit stood Jacques Bénigne Bossuet, the Eagle of Meaux, the greatest orator in Christendom. His task was impossible. He had to eulogize a man who was a known traitor, a bad husband, and a sodomite in the most sacred church in Paris, before the most pious court in Europe. Bossuet's funeral oration for the Prince de Condé is considered a masterpiece of French literature, but it is also a masterpiece of historical erasure. With soaring rhetoric, Bossuet painted a portrait of a flawed but ultimately saintly hero. He acknowledged Condé's rebellion, but framed it as a youthful error born of too much fire. He spoke of his penitence, his final submission to God. But what he left out was deafening. He did not mention the petit maîtresse. He did not mention the Italian vice. He did not mention the wife rotting in prison. He created the myth that would endure for centuries, the Grand Condé as a pure, tragic hero, a French Achilles. As the coffin was lowered into the crypt, the reality of Louis de Bourbon was buried with it. The man who had kissed his male favorites in front of the court, who had laughed at the mass, who had loved men, and young ones at that, was erased. In his place stood a marble statue, cold, chaste, and acceptable, but history has a way of unearthing the dead. While Bossuet's voice echoed in the cathedral, the private letters remained. The memoirs of Tallemant, of Bussy Rabutin, of the caustic Saint-Simon, they sat in drawers in libraries ticking like time bombs. They contained the truth, and they would ensure that one day the marble would crack, and the man, complex, brilliant, cruel, and queer, would emerge again. Indeed, the funeral candles at Notre Dame had barely been extinguished before the dark legacy of the Grand Condé began to manifest in the flesh of his heir. The title of Monsieur le Prince passed to his son, Henri Jules de Bourbon. If Louis had been a man of terrifying contradictions, a genius plagued by cruelty, Henri Jules was simply a man consumed by madness. The Condé insanity whispered about for generations flowered fully in him. He was a figure of Gothic horror. While he possessed a sharp wit and a certain physical courage, his mind was shattered. He suffered from clinical lycanthropy. Courtiers reported with shudders that the first prince of the blood would often drop to all fours in the corridors of Chantilly, barking and howling like a dog. He was terrified of death, refusing to sleep in a bed for fear he would not wake up, choosing instead to wander the halls until dawn. But the most chilling aspect of Henri Jules was not his madness, but his mimicry. He attempted to copy his father's lifestyle without possessing a shred of his father's charm or justification. He too surrounded himself with young men, but where Louis had inspired genuine devotion and camaraderie among the petits maîtres, Henri Jules inspired only fear. He was a sadist who delighted in the physical pain of his servants and his family. He beat his wife, the long-suffering Anne of Bavaria, with a cane. He forced his guests to endure humiliations for his amusement. It was as if the Italian vice and the libertine spirit of the father had been filtered through a diseased mind, stripping away the romance and leaving only the predation. The house of Condé, under his rule, became a gilded asylum, a place where the grandeur of the Grand Siècle rotted from within. And what of the woman who had started this long tragedy? Claire Clémence de Maillé-Brézé, the little wretch, remained locked in the fortress of Châteauroux. She outlived her husband by 8 years. It is one of the most painful ironies of this story that the woman who had once commanded armies to save her husband was forgotten by the world he left behind. Even in death, Condé's hatred reached out to strike her. In his will, he made no mention of her. He did not grant her freedom. Her son, Henri Jules, maintained her imprisonment with the same ruthlessness as his father, seeing her not as a mother but as a stain on the family honor. She died in 1694, alone, her mind clouded by decades of isolation. While Condé lay in a magnificent tomb, his heart enshrined in a silver casket, Claire Clémence was buried with little ceremony in the chapel of the castle that had been her prison. Her grave was eventually lost to time, a final erasure of the woman who had been the collateral damage of a hero's ego. As the 18th century dawned, the myth-making machine went into overdrive. The French monarchy, tottering toward its own destruction in the Revolution, needed heroes. The Grand Condé was the perfect candidate. He was the embodiment of aristocratic valor, the man who had humbled Spain. The historians and eulogists went to work. They took the chisel to his life story, chipping away the inconvenient truths. The petit maître vanished from the pages of history books. The letters to male lovers were suppressed or reinterpreted as platonic effusions of the soul. The cruelty to his wife was dismissed as domestic incompatibility or blamed on her supposed insanity. Voltaire, writing his Age of Louis XIV, praised Condé's military genius while carefully soft-pedaling his private life. The Enlightenment philosophers admired his skepticism and his patronage of the arts, conveniently ignoring the fact that his freedom was built on the absolute subjugation of those around him. By the 19th century, the sanitization was complete. In the era of Victorian morality and rising nationalism, there was no room for a queer, wife-abusing hero. Condé became a statue in the literal and figurative sense. He was the bronze figure on the esplanade, the name on the boulevards, the chapter in the military textbooks. He was reduced to a set of dates and battles, Rocroi, Freiburg, Nördlingen, Lienz. The man of flesh and blood, the man who smelled of gunpowder and heavy perfume, who wept over the bodies of handsome young officers and locked his wife in a dungeon, was lost. It was only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries that the silence began to break. As historians began to look at the past through new lenses, examining gender, sexuality, and the private lives of the elite, the Grand Condé re-emerged. The publication of unexpurgated memoirs and the careful analysis of the coded language of the 17th century allowed us to reconstruct the truth. We stopped looking at him merely as a general and started seeing him as a man navigating the complex sexual and social landscapes of his time. We recognize that his story is a vital chapter in queer history. It challenges our assumptions about the past. It proves that same-sex desire and culture were not invented in the modern era. They were always there, thriving in the very heart of the establishment, protected by privilege and silence. However, this rediscovery brings us to the final, uncomfortable reckoning. How do we judge Louis de Bourbon? It is tempting to claim him as an icon, a rebel who defied the suffocating norms of the church and the state to love who he wanted. There is a certain grim heroism in his refusal to apologize for his nature, in the way he forced the most powerful court in Europe to accept his terms. He lived authentically in an age of hypocrisy. But we cannot embrace the rebel without confronting the tyrant. His freedom was purchased at a terrible cost to others. He was a classic example of the great man of history, a figure of immense talent and charisma who was also a moral disaster. He reminds us that genius is not a virtue. A man can write tender love letters to a page boy and sign a warrant for his wife's imprisonment with the same hand. The legacy of the Grand Condé is not a simple lesson in military tactics or a scandalous tale of court gossip. It is a mirror held up to the nature of power itself. Power allowed him to win battles, but it also allowed him to escape the consequences of his cruelty. It allowed him to live a double life that would have destroyed a lesser man. In the end, he conquered the Spanish tercios, he conquered the Frond, and he conquered the judgment of his contemporaries. But he could not conquer the judgment of history. Today, if you visit the Château de Chantilly, you will see the vast gardens he planted, the reflection pools that mirror the sky, and the statues of the philosophers he patronized. It is a place of breathtaking beauty and order, but if you listen closely to the wind rustling through the trees, you might hear the echoes of the other story, the laughter of the petit maître, the barking of the mad son, and the silence of the forgotten wife. The Grand Condé lies dead, but the paradox of his life, the intertwined roots of glory and shame, remains alive, a testament to the messy, brilliant, and terrifying complexity of the human heart. He was and remains the magnificent monster of the Grand Siècle.